All right, welcome. Good evening. It's a minute after 8 o'clock. We're going to rock and roll right here on Straight Up 107.1 FM. Good evening to all of you on the ground, those folks who are listening to us via their radios, maybe their cars, maybe their minibuses, wherever you are. And to all of the security guards, security guards who may be in their guard huts or wherever they are. Good evening to all of you. We're going to rock and roll for 1 hour. So do spread the word, share the link, right? We're just going to say that once. And we're going to say that in the beginning of the show. Share the link. We're not going to wait until we get to the end, close off, and ask you to share the link. We just do it once. In the beginning, we ask of you to share the link. We'll be right back with our guest. We'll talk economics. We'll talk politics. We'll talk law. We'll talk human rights violations. Those are serious matters that we will talk about right here on 107.1 FM.
She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frock, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For cockacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cock-a-crow, dagabag, donkey, bray, horse, and they even duck a quack. Cock-a-crow, dagabag, donkey, bray, horse, and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. All day a back down, me now a come home. The naga jackass yard for fetchy load. Cockle shy hand, bag over shoulder, running by his side, a Rexy and Rover. From the farm, them a come. Sun a go down but up the river. Some washing clothes, some folks are bathing at the water. Fisherman, they catch them a bring. From a canoe boat, man, them start offloading. Aymara, Kwakwari, Hail Baka Kuma Kuma, even Lokunani. Aymara, Kwakwari, Hail Baka Kuma Kuma, even Banga Mary. Listen to this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. Them children glad when the weekend come. Out in the yard, them all gather round. Some a play catcher, some making house from straw. Two who come later, a grandma or grandpa. All a sit down just a wait. Moonlight so bright, it's just the right time to listen story or to say a little nursery rhyme. Grandpa voice a echo in the night as he tell you tales, some picnic are there with fright. Oh, Ligan, Mungeza, Massa Kurma Buranansi, even Watamuma. Oh, Ligan, Moongazer, Massa Kurma Buranansi, even Watamuma. Yeah, man, that's the true story that tell the people about life in the country, life in the country.
This ain't a long time, this ain't a long time, this not a before time. This ain't a long time, this ain't a long time, this not a before time. This ain't a long time, this ain't a long time, this not a before time. Long time got them long, long low, now you got them bongo low. Long time got them long,
you are looking to have your statutory declaration, affidavit of income, identity, damage or lost passport, lost license, tenancy agreement, agreement of settlement, power of attorney, last will and testament, and certification of documents, then you need to visit the Alistair Collins firm, located at the Killian Mall, 162 Lamaha Street in Georgetown, between Camp and Waterloo Street. Alistair Collins is a commissioner of oaths and a justice of the peace. Make certain you visit him or call for more information at 649-6410 or 685-6448 or 503-1451. And there's adequate parking available. Go down to the Alistair Collins firm and have all of your legal issues settled and brought to the fore. Alistair Collins firm. Contact them at Alistair Collins firm.
All right. Hey, guess what? Good evening. It's just about 8 minutes after 9 o'clock. That's Eastern. It's 8 minutes after 9 o'clock in beautiful, beautiful Guyana. And I say that with all sincerity. Beautiful, beautiful Guyana. Put aside the politics, put aside the bad economics, put aside the breakdown of rule of law and the fact that we hardly have democracy in Guyana. Put all of those things aside. And of course, you know what is happening there. Tonight, our guest will be dealing with those issues. I have tons of questions for them. But let me first of all say good evening and welcome to Straight Up. Let's get straight down into business as we usually do. We say good evening to all of you around the world, all of you specifically, those in Guyana as well, in Linden, beautiful Linden. You guys will have a new school soon, right? Maybe in the next 24 months. You know how things going in Guyana. I said, and you see, I'm all, well, tonight I have on a suit, right? It's because I went down to the building, to the courthouse, and I decided to register a company. I want to do some building as well. And so show me some sort of respect as of this evening. Contractor, Ben Shop. I want to build something I want to build. I want to be part and parcel of those lucky individuals. Shanghai. Shanghai is a very, very lucky guy. Good evening to you, Shanghai, if you're listening. Maybe one of these days I will get Shanghai and the crew to come on up and to talk a little bit about how excited they are about the contract that they just landed there in Linden for $346 million. $346 million. I'd like to hear the story behind that. Some folks are saying that Shanghai has never built anything in his life. I don't know. I can't say, but I probably have heard that too, that Shanghai has never built anything in his life. But they are free to come here to talk as to how they got that contract, whether it was transparent, whether it was there in the public's domain for others to bid. I don't know. So Shanghai, I know you're watching. Feel free to come on the show. An invitation is extended to you and your crew to come on and let's hear what's happening and how long you guys are going to take to build that school, whether it's 24 days, whether it's 24 months. We'd like to see the design. Are you guys going to use zinc roof and all these? Zinc roof is kind of like old and outdated, right? These are things we want to know. We just don't want to hear that a $346 million contract awarded to Shanghai, who and his team there. Custom Shanghai is the football kind of guy. So he moved from kicking football to building school. Shanghai might say, you know, why when black people get to lose something, people got abused out and cuss out. And I'm talking in Shanghai's voice. Those of you who know Shanghai, right? They might think it's a good thing. And they might think it's all sort of things. It's more political, if you ask me. But if the brothers, they get up $346 million and they see that as a success story, they have to know what they're talking about, right? So what else we can talk about before we get to our guest? This young lady, I don't know, her name is Vanessa Kissoon, right? She has been reinstated into the party, the People's National Congress Reform. She was basically kicked out, so to speak, because of something, absolutely something. I don't know, some beef she had with the then General Secretary, Oscar Clark. And I've known Oscar Clark when I was a little boy, which was a long time ago, right? And Oscar Clark has been General Secretary of the party, the PNC, for over 10, 12, I know, a long time. I don't know. The party needs a young General Secretary. A young General Secretary. Maybe Vanessa Kissoon. I don't know if our guest, Elson Lowe, wants to get involved in that. I don't know. I don't know if Agre wants to do that. Agre looks like the type you said, leader or nothing. I don't know. Sharma Solomon is with us as well. I don't know. But I will support any day of Vanessa Kissoon. Maybe she should have been running for leadership, man. Then I would probably have a horse in the race. You never know that too. But she, chairman of the party, hell yes, I'll close my eyes and vote for Vanessa Kissoon. Why? Because she's been there. She's been on the ground. She has the experience. And so she knows what it's like to fight for people. And those are the sort of people we want to see in politics. We want to, at least for me, you know, people who just jump on social media and they talk fancy talk, they do up their hair, and some of them put on their little suit and tie and these things. They're not going to impress me with that at all. They're not going to impress me. I want to see work. What have you done? And Vanessa Kissoon stands out, man. In other words, who vex? Vanessa Kissoon stands out. And I salute her. And I thank those who are responsible at Congress Place to ensuring that they expedite this process to have her reinstated in the party. And I say thank you to all of our listeners who have been battling for this to become a reality. And kudos to all of you, every single one of you. So congratulations to Miss Vanessa Kissoon. She's back on track with the party. Congress nomination day is on the 11th, which is tomorrow. In fact, tomorrow. Will she be nominated? Will Miss Vanessa Kissoon be nominated for leader of the party, chairman of the party, vice chairman? I hope she goes to chairman or vice chairman. I hope she does that, right? She should win that without any real challenge. Oh yes, Vanessa Kissoon. She's back in the party. What else is happening? What else can we talk about? But when we have our guest on, I want to talk about this. You see this here? It's not about the splitting of the mango. It is about the splitting of Georgetown. And what the PPP is doing, they are cutting Georgetown into two pieces because they, over the years, historically, they cannot win Georgetown. Region 4. And so they're cutting Georgetown into two pieces because they want to find a way to dominate the political scene. And as corrupt as their approach is, it must be stopped. Now, hearing people talk about if they were chairman of Region 4, or if they were mayor, they chase this body out and chase the body out and chase. That sort of arrogance. Go underground. When people are on the ground, it's a different reality than when they are in the air. And when I say in the air, away from Guyana, the talks are always fancy. But on the ground, it is different. It is totally different. Anybody can live as far as they live and talk about all sorts of fancy things and if this and if I was this and this is what and chase and this. Look, this is what matters. Boots on the ground, right? Real boots on the ground. Not pia as Clem David would say, talking about boots on the ground. Real boots on the ground. People are tired of the fancy talks on social media about boots on the ground doing back in dung and all this. Not enough of that BS. Enough of that. Real boots on the ground. You see that boots? It is boots on the ground that matters, right? And the citizens, there come a time now that the citizens will have to stop with this whole This whole political rhetoric and sweet talking on social media. Anyways, enough of that. Let's congratulate these people. 182nd anniversary, the people of Victoria. 100, 100, yes, 100, 100. It's time that we bring these old men on. 100. Let's begin with them. Good evening, gentlemen. How are you?
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
We're getting some energy, but Mr. Solomon, your volume is a bit low. Good evening.
My volume is low.
Oh,
I hope it's up now.
Oh, I hope maybe your volume is a bit low. Let's get it going. How are you doing, Mr. Solomon?
I am good, Mark. Blessed good evening to you, your guests.
How important is this day? Let's touch with Agre briefly. 182nd anniversary. The village of Victoria pulled up our not indentured ancestors, but those of our ancestors who were enslaved. Some people love to say that they're lazy, they don't like work, they don't do this, they don't know business. But these are people over 180 something years ago, pulled up their resources, pulled up their monies, and they bought a big village, a village that was able to welcome other folks in it. Your take, Mr. Agre, first on that.
What I like to look at Victoria as, good night, Mark, fellow guests, and your viewers. Victoria has been remarked and spoken about across the Caribbean. If you really look at this from a regional perspective, Victoria started the village movement that we see from our neighbors next door, Suriname, to Haiti in the north, where they truly were the people who, back then when news used to travel by word of mouth and by mail, Victoria was like, if there's a volcano blow up in St. Vincent, that was the talk of the Caribbean at that point. So if you read your Caribbean history, you will see that Victoria is not just 180 something years, a village up the East Coast you could drive and go to, where we have a lot of history and economic development. Victoria actually set movement regionally. And it's always good to speak about things in Guyana from a regional context, because sometimes we downplay our significance, not just at home, but in the regional development and in its ethos of moving forward and what has now become the CARICOM. So even up to today, if you go to St. Vincent and if you go to Haiti and you read some of the books and the writings back then, some of the leaders quoted and referred to what happened in Guyana in Victoria. So these things that really need to edify our people is significant. A village that we will pass if you go in Berbice or somewhere had on what we know as the CARICOM and the regional development.
Good, well said. Quickly, thank you, Mr. Agre Marsh. Appreciate that quick, rundown on the history of Agricola, that beautiful village, that strong village. Mr. Lowe, your quick view on Victoria Village on its anniversary.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. Really are good points. I think one of the things that always stands out to me about Victoria's story and about the story of various villages, various plantations that were purchased and turned into villages. Let's frame it the right way. Is that it really is a source of pride, I think, for the Afro-Guyanese community, and it really kind of shows from an international perspective what can be done by peoples who formerly were enslaved. And I think it really serves to break a lot of stereotypes that we've seen, not just in Guyana, but across the entire Western world when it comes to people of African descent. It really is a model that we should look back at and take heart in, because ultimately, all of these stereotypes that have developed over the years in the post-slavery environment are very harmful. But we have here a symbol, and we have here an experience really in the heart of discrimination, because in the post-slavery days is when discrimination was at its height. There's all sorts of ridiculous, antiquated laws that you see in Guyana, which date from the post-slavery era. And so for them to be able to band together and to actually purchase a plantation and create for a whole village for them to live really says something. It shows their determination. It shows their willingness to fight the system and their willingness to really ensure that there was a positive change. So from that perspective, I always look at it as something that I take great pride in, and I think that every Guyanese should take great pride in, but also something that really breaks a lot of the stereotypes that we see here in Guyana and across the Western world.
Lots of stereotypes indeed. It has been able to break that because, they have some people who are of the view that persons of African descent couldn't achieve anything, that they're lazy and all sorts of things. And we see the village movement that started actually under over 180 something years ago by those same folks who were enslaved. They pooled their monies, they pooled their resources, they bought villages all across the country. And those villages were able to be developed, houses made, and others were welcomed into those villages even years after. So the history is very strong. Briefly, Mr. Sharma Solomon, on the 182nd anniversary of that beautiful village of Victoria.
Yeah, Mark, you hearing me better now?
Sure, we heard you loud and clear. Go ahead, sir.
Sorry about the sound system earlier.
That's all right.
I could not agree more with both the speakers before me on the aspects that they address, the context in which Victoria, our forest village bought by enslaved Africans, represent. But to add to that, it represents one of the greatest economic empowerment movement seen just less than 5 years after slavery, where such an economic model, and we see that model even representative in our society today in issues matters such as co-ops and throwing back sand. It represented not only the economic ability of the enslaved Africans, it represented the structure that they held on to, an economic structure that caused for them to be able to almost immediately after slavery, be able to demonstrate that ability to purchase villages, to purchase lands that they would have worked on. But in return, they would have been able, according to our history, been able to loan those slave masters who took them in for centuries and even gave money to them. So Victoria represents that. It represents where even the Afro-Guyanese in Guyana can see a model. And like I said, those models exist as a structure, as a concept, where enslaved Africans could have empowered themselves is still relevant today. So to agree with the point that your guests made earlier about just looking at it from that historical significance of what it represents across the Caribbean, I want to take also our present context of what we see before us in a village that still exists. And I speak proudly of Victoria because I have family in Victoria. Tonight they're probably listening in Victoria. I have the Eliases and the Solomons from Golden Grove. So I am from the East Coast. I spent some years in both Victoria, Golden Grove, and also in the Backlist. My mom is from there. So I see the pride in people, and I see also that ability for them to go back to history, to their villages. And we saw where even in Linden, that attitude represented economic prosperity. So my advice to those who are seeing Victoria celebrate now, just the history, also celebrate the legacy of what we can build on today.
Well said, the legacy of what we can build on today. And that legacy is so strong that we need to build in a unified manner, because over the years, you see everybody just pull and tug in a different direction. And those villages have actually, not been as strong as they should be, as they used to be. So let us hope that all those who are listening in the village of Victoria and other villages can get back to that sort of togetherness. And remember that saying, it takes a village, an entire village. And the people of Victoria, our ancestors, actually pooled their resources and they bought villages across the country like Victoria. Congratulations to the people of Victoria on the celebration of their 182nd anniversary. 182nd anniversary. Let's move on to other stuff. And here is where we go now to some political matters. The CEO, the application process is open And here it is that lots of persons have sent in their applications. Some of them are suspects. In fact, one of those suspects have since withdrawn. That is Gokul Buddha. He's gone. He's done. He's out of the race. He's been kicked to the curb, which is good. He did it all by himself. But here it is that we have a commissioner, and he's supposed to be a commissioner for the coalition side, right? He's saying here, GECOM says, and basically what it's saying here, GECOM says no to independent panel for selection of CEO. No to independent panel. What is your take? Let's give Mr. Lowe a quick shot at that. Are you comfortable with that or not, sir?
Well, what I'd say is I think obviously this process will attract a lot of scrutiny. But when you say independent panel, the question is who is going to comprise that panel? How are we going to identify people to be on that panel? And to what extent will that panel really be independent? So I think those are questions that have to be answered before we can ever consider something to that effect. I think GECOM obviously has indicated that they are not comfortable with that. But for me, I first of all would take issue with the question of whether it be independent or not, because I think unless we can have some sort of a guarantee of that, I suppose if the UN was to send a panel, maybe that would be helpful. But I think there's maybe not as much trust in multilateral organizations as there used to be. I'll highlight for you a very interesting situation with a multilateral organization this evening. I think that's really the crux of the issue. And the important thing as well for us to remember is ultimately whoever it is that is chosen, we want Guyanese to be comfortable with that person, or as comfortable as they can be. And if they're not comfortable with the independent panel, then they'll never be comfortable with the person. So I think that's really the way that we ought to think about this process.
All right, let's go to Mr. Gray, and the same question to you, sir, concerning the independent panel that GECOM said no to, according to that report. Your take on the independent panel, sir.
The funny thing is, it's very hard for us as a country to find independent people. I mean, history has shown one way or the other, people usually swing under pressure or with or without pressure. And it really says a lot about our country that we cannot find 5 people or 10 people that can say, listen, these people are independent, they're fair, they're based on merit, they're open to ideas, they have no biases. To just see like a CEO, you must understand how bad we have to be that one, the organization says no to independent panel. And as Mr. Lowe alluded to just now, even if you have a panel, there are going to be sections of the country, they're not a small few sections, but big sections of the country will disagree with persons because either say your family is X, your relative is Y, your mother was this, your father was that, but not looking at, okay, is this person, 1, capable, 2, intelligent and competent to analyze and help make a good decision, and 3, is this person good who can ask the right questions, not just to set the post up for pomp and ceremony, but who can ask the right questions to give us a result that we will be comfortable with going forward. But I think that given the history, I heard that there was a guy from Jamaica who also applied. So we clearly attracting regional attention these days. So I am hopeful, and I'm an eternal optimist. I'm always looking at the optimistic outcome of things.
So basically, in essence, what you're saying that you wouldn't mind an independent, or your preference would be for an independent?
Yes, my preference would be for an independent.
All right, good. But take into consideration that if you have 15 suspects, I'm not sure how much the independent panel can work. Let's head straight over to Mr. Sharma Solomon. Sharma, your take on that independent.
Mark, I think that independent come with based on who is defining that in Guyana at the moment. All right. And both coming from your guests, it represents the lack of trust on whether we can find that sort of independence and the definition of who's going to be defining that. The entire issue about these bodies should be independent. They should be independent. The way GECOM itself is, and I think you mentioned that Vincent is a coalition commissioner. I think Vincent would, Mr. Alexander, mind you, would correct you. He would tell you that he was appointed by the coalition, but he acts on behalf of the national interest because
you see, Mr. Sharma, let me cut you there. That's the problem, and this is with all due respect to Vincent Alexander. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Vincent. I've known him over the years, but I would disagree with that. That he was appointed. He was appointed. Let me go ahead, make your point.
I would agree with your disagreement, and it's not a problem. I am telling you, however, what I have seen from Mr. Alexander.
Because you know that PPP, Sharma, the PPP appointed commissioners see themselves, they go there, they represent the interest of the PPP. But these coalition
two things, Mark.
Commissioners feel as though that they don't have a right to represent the interest of the coalition. We're starting off now. The show getting hostile. Go ahead, Sharma.
I like this because you're saying that the coalition, but the history also of Vincent is twice that whether he is acting right now and we believe in any interest of a particular party, it was Mr. Alexander who pointed out in 2006 and even 2011 and in 2015, where we saw that the PPP were making moves in the figures. So I think now to say he is not representing a particular interest because the coalition may seem disadvantaged, I think is a bit unfair when it comes to what he represented before. But however, the point is, he will have to represent that. Those commissioners that were identified to sit on GECOM are expected to have that sort of autonomy by which they can act and act in the interest of our Constitution, first and foremost. I believe any such agency stemming from that, because of the lack of trust, in reality and in principle, should have that independence. We're not there as yet. So I could understand GECOM's position at the moment to speak on the side of caution, because we must recognize we have a government that so far have not listened to, have not met with the opposition leader, have not considered any other opinions, whether it's social interest from trade unions. Look around, COVID handling, flood handling. So I think that lack of trust, and though the coalition got work to do, we must not overlook where a portion of our society stands on these issues. So GECOM, and like every other autonomous agency, must and should be independent. The Constitution provides for that. That's
it should be independent, but it's not.
And that's the point. And I'm giving you the rationale.
Regardless of how we twist it, regardless of how we turn it, it has always been problematic, especially when the PPP is in office. And we give at least I give the coalition kudos under David Arthur Granger, the president of Guyana, for attempting to correct those problems and weed out those thieving people out of GECOM. We know who they are. And we're going to go very cool. We're going to go very cool.
I like what you're saying. So quickly. So, you know, I like my culture structure.
No, but what I'm saying about...
But those structures, Mark. Those
Sharma,
structures...
I'm going to turn your mic off.
No problem.
you know, I wouldn't do that to you.
Mark, but I'm saying to you, the structures that were attempted to fix, those same structures like GECOM, and you can identify and respect what our previous president, Mr. Granger, did. Because those structures are easy to dismantle, and we see the dismantling, it affects the culture of confidence in those agencies. And that is the culture-structure relationship. If the structures are not proper, we'll have certain speculations and people are not convinced, like you are, that GECOM will not work in our interest. So, of course, there were efforts, but deep enough were those efforts, we see the PPP working to dismantle that as we speak right now. And that will create lack of confidence in our society.
Back again to the lack of confidence. I agree with you, Sharma Solomon there. Our other guests are Elson Lowe, We're going to talk about economics just now, and we have a Gray Marsh as well. Let me give, because Mr. Lowe likes to talk about his economics. And I want to ask you a question, Mr. Lowe, pertaining to this here. The World Bank report, it says here, it shows massive gaps in systems to track poor countries' debts. Now, I'm sure you read that report, and in page 101 or somewhere there, it talks about for the 2020 period, our what is it? Our national debt is about 1.5 billion US dollars. What's happening? Talk to us. Economics.
Hi, I just wanted to really quickly touch on the last question before I lead into the economics.
Sure.
And I think really the structure again as institutions creates these kinds of problems. Because I'll give you a scenario. I'm not sure that the GECOM commission would be in any way different if we only had one commissioner that was a PPP commissioner and one that was representing the coalition, right? If we just had those two, it would be exactly the same commission. And so the idea of having all these commissioners and this facade of everybody being, totally in the national interest and not representing various parties, I think is pretty classic of Guyana. And I say the same thing about Parliament. Because of the way that Parliament is structured, you can have one parliamentarian in there on each side, just says yes, just says no, and that'd be pretty much it. The way that our institutions are structured is not to promote independence, but to promote political motives. I personally have always said that I think the GECOM commissioners should be appointed by a 2/3 majority in the parliament. I think that all senior officials in this country should be 2/3 majority in the parliament, and they should be forced to face questions that are televised, the way that people face questions that are televised in the US and other countries, so that we can know exactly why they want to be commissioners and so on. And so I think the structure of our institutions is poor, and as a result, we see all these conflicts popping up all over the place. Now, on the issue,
I can't, before we get to that economics, I can't disagree with you on that at all. But let me get back to Sharma Solomon as it pertains to Mr. Vincent Alexander. All I'm simply saying is that the party appointed Mr. Alexander and two others, Mr. Charles Corbin and Mr. Desmond Trotman, to represent in terms of to look over the interest of the party, of course, in keeping with the Constitution. We see that the PPP commissioners do that all the time. But when it comes to well, supposedly, when I say I'm talking about the three now opposition commissioners. They have to be speaking out more. Most of them are hardly speaking, and therefore those in the opposition don't have an idea as to what the heck is happening in GECOM. For the most part, I give Mr. Vincent Alexander credit because he seems to be the one speaking most of the times. But when you compare to the parroting of the PPP appointed commissioners, understand where I'm coming from. Opposition people are at a loss as to what the heck is happening in GECOM. Maybe because the opposition commissioners feel as though they have a constitutional duty and not a party position to come back and report to their party. I just thought I mentioned that. Back to the economics, Mr.
No
Lowe.
problem, Mark.
Mr. Lowe, economics. What is happening here?
As Mr. Bencher would have mentioned, the show is now getting started, right?
Yes.
So as it concerns the buildup of national debt in Guyana, there are two important things to consider, which we have to look at everything. We have to look at everything through these lenses. And I say this from the perspective that when we were crafting the Natural Resources Fund Act, there's some Chilean specialists that came over to help us, as they have a very reputable sovereign wealth fund. And one of the pieces of advice that they provided to us is that we should be spending the oil revenues themselves rather than borrowing, because we're going to have to pay interest from all of these loans. And if we can actually spend the monies that are available there, it's the same money that's being spent, but we would actually be able to save. So what is going on is that we're seeing borrowing and we're racking up substantial interest payments, because if you're going to have $1.5 billion of debt, and if you're going to have, there's talk of borrowing from the Chinese and so on, an additional, I think it's $1.5 billion, that is going to rack up substantial interest. Now, the question is, why are they not operationalizing? Why are they not using the Natural Resources Fund Act? And if they intend to change it, why are they not making the changes? Of course, we will scrutinize those changes because there's some very concerning things that we're hearing. Like they want to use the Natural Resources Fund structure, the sovereign wealth fund structure, from, I think it is it's countries that are not the on the top in terms of anti-corruption and in terms of the integrity of their institutions. I think it's Kazakhstan that they mentioned that they want to use, which is that's a dictatorship that doesn't have a good corruption record. So that raises a lot of red flags. That is the first thing. The second thing is, though, now that you're borrowing this money, how are we using this money, and is it being used effectively, and do we have some of this money being stolen? So I imagine that a substantial amount of what is being borrowed will be put towards these large infrastructure projects, right? So we've got the Demerara Harbor Bridge, we've got the Gas Ashore project, we've got Amalia. The borrowing will, and this will continue over the course of many years, facilitate these projects. However, as I pointed out in a show recently, it alarms me that I was able to come across a headline, which from Kite or Stabroek, which indicated that the winner of the bid, or that many of the bidders for the Amalia Falls project were blacklisted by the World Bank for fraud and corruption and so on and so forth, and that the winner of the bid or the bidders as well were all blacklisted by the World Bank for fraud and corruption. This is for the Demerara Harbor Bridge, right? So I don't know why it is we're dealing with businesses that the World Bank has said that they will not deal with because of fraud and corruption. Because now we must ask ourselves the question, I mean, we don't know if these businesses are engaged in any corruption, but it is possible, and it's something that should concern us. And so if we're going to borrow money, first of all, we're paying interest on this, and then we're going to spend this money. And if we're going to face corruption scandals where a lot of this money is going to be siphoned off, then, $100 is not going to give you $100 of value. It probably might give you $50 or $60 of value, and you've lost $40 easily of value. But we didn't talk about the interest rate. And if we're getting the 10% now, was that another 10 off? So you're only getting $50 out of every $100 that we spend. These are things that are very concerning. The other thing that I just want to make sure our viewers understand is the VP recently said that he thinks that the fiscal sustainability element of the Natural Resources Fund is garbage and it should be discarded. Of course, the fiscal sustainability element of that fund is to ensure that we don't spend out all the oil money and that we have structures in place so that we save for future generations. Now, when I hear people say that we should discard it and it's garbage and we don't have to worry about that, I'm immediately struck by thoughts of Venezuela. Because I'll tell you what, in their sovereign wealth fund, which they have sovereign wealth fund, they have money put aside, but how much money do they have put aside? Not much. And so when you say, oh, we don't have to worry about saving for future generations, we don't have to worry about the pace at which we spend, those things are not important things. I get very concerned because this is how you end up on, like Venezuela, this is how you walk that path. And we as a nation need to ask ourselves whether this is the path that we want to walk. Because we could end up at the end of all of this oil and gas, at the end of this arc of the oil and gas industry with very little to show for it. Substantial corruption corruption scandals across our entire history, and not a whole lot of improvement in people's standards of living. And in fact, amongst the most corrupt countries, such as Equatorial Guinea, people's standards of living actually fell after they got oil. So that is what we're faced with. And when we see this type of borrowing, we need to ask some serious questions.
Massive borrowing indeed. As it stands now, the World Bank states that our Guyana's GDP is $5.5 billion, but yet our external debt is 1.5, which is about 25 to 30% of our gross GDP, our GDP. How concerning is that for such a small nation?
So one of the things that I think we need to clarify is this. So it is generally regarded that anything around 30 to 40% of our nation's GDP is a comfortable level of debt. So the amount of debt is not the problem. What is the problem is the way that we're using this debt and the costs that we're incurring and the corruption scandals that are likely to come from it. So we can borrow and we can spend. That's okay. We'll develop the country and so on. That's fine. We can sustain a substantial amount of debt because the economy is growing very, very quickly. In fact, next year the economy is supposed to grow, I think it's 40% from the additional oil and gas. That obviously implies that we can, grow the debt by a substantial amount as well. But if you're growing this debt to steal the money, to waste the money, and to pay interest, then we have a problem here. So it's not just about the growth of the economy. It's not just about the growth of your debt. What are you doing with these monies? And right now, as we look at these projects, there are some concerns. If we look at the gas to shore project, that project has more than doubled in cost in only a short year of the PPP looking at that particular project. More than doubled in cost. And so when I say that it's a real worry that about 50% of what we are getting is going to be lost to corruption and mismanagement, I'm not saying this idly. We're seeing quoted 900 million as the cost. I have received some confidential estimates that this thing should not cost more than 600 million. So that 300 million, where is that going? And so what I say this all to say, we have to look at the trajectory of the country. And as much as the country expands, we must not confuse expansion with progress, because progress will be measured in the improvement in people's everyday lives. And if we see this kind of money being stolen and so on and so forth, we're not going to get anywhere near what we should from the vast resources available to our country.
Well said. When we get back to Mr. Lowe, we want him to explain a little bit about austerity, because this is the big debate that's happening now in the economics world about austerity versus stimulus. But let's get to Mr. Sharma Solomon as it pertains to ExxonMobil and $9-point-something billion of which they have spent, and taxpayers of Guyana will have to foot that bill. What is your take on that?
So just 2 points, Mark, quickly to what Mr. Lowe addressed. I think not forgetting why the PPP behaves in such a way. While they behave in such a way also, we are of the Paris Club. It means any loan we are taking, we take it at full rate, like any developed country. So there's no concession for Guyana. Guyana is in the eyes of the world and the World Bank, a well-to-do state, because we are doing that. Now, I'll come to your question from that point, but before I go there, there is a structure in place to ensure accountability, and the structure is already in law, and it was put in place by our former finance minister and team, that if you were to draw down on the oil money, the sort of structures you will have to go through. You will have to first enact those committees that should have been enacted, and you will have to ensure those committees comprise of people from the stakeholdership, including the opposition, the World Bank, and also trade unions. And I believe it is because the PPP recognize that they will be so scrutinized, they will not go through those structures to access what is rightfully Guyanese in the Sovereign Wealth Fund or in those reserves. They will prefer to borrow money, and borrow money at an interest that is not the way Guyana 10 years ago got the opportunity to cut interest, but at full amount. Now, but why do we see that? Why do we see the PPP in essence overlooking these structures? You recognize that it carries conditions. For example, you have to ensure sustainability of these projects that you're witnessing now. We saw the PPP recognizing in most of the big projects they're doing, they're prepared to overlook. The EPA plays no part in this anymore. Those are some of the conditions that will allow you to even be able to move forward with some of these projects. And the PPP has forgotten completely about that. But again, growth don't means development, Mark, in the terms of economics. So Guyana may be a growing state. Guyana may be a growing nation, but what you see as development reflective of the poor is still where people are suffering from high cost to live in. I am going to take you to this point of auditing of $9 billion, Mark. Here it is you have, and I hope to hear those voices. I saw people are prepared to take the government to court. Those weren't the only 3 people who made noise when $18 million, as they would have ensured, was placed in the area that the world can scrutinize 18 million bonus for Exxon, but we are not on the same aggressiveness for $9 billion. I find it quite hypocritical, but more troubling in our society when people cannot find reasoning the way they were so aggressive to ensure accountability for this amount of money and for the conditions under which we should ensure we have a secure, sustainable society moving forward. And we are taking that for granted. So that for me represents the most important point of accountability, the public accountability, where now not only 3 persons, but the entire nation should realize what is behind the issue of this government finding it as an unwilling act to pursue ensuring the auditing of $9 billion, but we were so easy to allow, when in opposition, this government to pursue 18 million US dollars. So that's just the point I'd like to make on this, and to address earlier the issue of where do we see growth, ensuring development in terms of going through those procedures that are legislated and to be enacted so that people can start to see this sort of development in terms of the oil spending and the oil wealth.
Well said, Mr. Sharma Solomon. I should let you know that the others, our listeners know that the others have been cut off. We seem to have them back. Thank you so much, Lemon. Mr. Lowe is back with us. Mr. Agray, I would have get his input in that. But Mr. Lowe, when you look at the chart of that report from the World Bank, you would see that from 2018, maybe 2019, 2007, somewhere around that period, that our debt was able to be paid off to some extent. And there we go again, that it appears from that chart that the coalition actually made tremendous amount of effort to lower our external debt. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes, the coalition management of debt and the economy overall was quite conservative, and as a result, we received a lot of plaudits for the way that we were running the economy. I just wanted, though, to make sure that I touched on the issue of this $9 billion. Because
but before you touch on that issue, Mr. Lowe, if you can please permit me for us to get an input from Mr. Agray Marsh first. Sure. Go ahead, Mr. Agray. Same question in terms of our economy and the sort of wild spendings by the PPP regime.
Right. So the funny thing is, we don't have discussions that are focused that was best for Guyana. We focus a discussion that what is best for my party and my interests. And if we were to apply this from a very scientific perspective, is this loan that we're going to take, is this loan going to help the young people in the future? Are you pushing this debt down the line so that the next generation is burdened? Okay. What is the best way to approach this loan? So 1, we get development, and 2, the future generations are not burdened. And if you apply this metric, apply this test to every single contract, whether it be loan from the World Bank, the IDB, the Chinese, the Europeans, whoever, private investors, public-private partnership, you will see that Guyanese will get a better deal. And I think once we raise the conversation and frame it from a perspective that, 1, you can't tell me that we haven't started auditing yet. And you can't tell me a country that has produced some very good accountants, we can't set up whether via the university or whatever to train up accountants within the GRA, within government, that they can now go forward and audit these accounts. Another thing too, you should be strengthening institutions to be able to monitor what is being spent and how things are being spent. There are multiple regional organizations that as a country we can go to have them look over for third and fourth opinion on a decision before we make it? Because no one is saying, no, you can't spend the money. What people want to know, and I coming back to a point Sharma made earlier, a fellow Golden Grove man, people's trust. If people looking at you award 2 massive contracts to companies that if I do a Google search without being a studied economist like Elson, I could realize that this company don't have a good track record. It's not like if the information is hidden, you could Google it and find it, you know? So my points are, one, they are institutions that we can go to. They are law firms, experienced global institutions that can vet the contracts and the deals that come to us as a country. Give us a professional outlook and profile, and we get more than one source. So as a country, we make a decision, okay, we will go to the Chinese for X, we'll go to the Europeans for Y, and we'll go to Dubai for Z. So at the end of the day, we have a country, an economy funded by different sources, not being held at the neck by any one particular system or system. That is what I think Guyanese would like to see, and they'll be confident and comfortable with, because a level of trust and transparency would have been returned.
You know, that is well said, Mr. Agre Marsh, but the reality is under the installed PPP regime, that is not something that we can look forward to, because what these people are accustomed to is corruption. And the more money they borrow, of course, taxpayers have to pay back, but the more money they borrow. Obviously, we're seeing is for substandard works and so forth. 2 inches roads and whatever. They're giving out hundreds of millions of dollars to friends and cronies, whether the people are competent or not. And taxpayers cannot get the real deal out of that. So under this installed regime, they're not concerned about development. They don't care how they spend the money. Their external debts keep going up and up. We saw what happened when they were in office. It was sky high. They couldn't pay it back because there was nothing at all. Now that we have oil, it's just another avenue for massive corruption under the PPP regime. Well, let's get back to Mr. Elton Lowe to talk about this $9+ billion that taxpayers now have to pay back to ExxonMobil executives for flying around the world, for eating, for sleeping, and God in heaven knows what else. 9-point-something billion US dollars. Your take, Mr. Lowe.
Yeah, so one of the things, so I don't know if your viewers know, but I was at the State Asset Recovery Agency. And while we were there, we were able to receive a training on some anti-corruption issues that are particularly concerning in resource extracting countries, and in particular with oil. And one of them comes back to the same issue of auditing properly these types of expenses. Because there's something called transfer pricing, which is where, and I'm not saying Exxon has done this, but I'm saying the audit is how we would know. You essentially would set up 10 different companies. And these 10 different companies will do business with each other, where they'll jack up the price on the goods. So Exxon now owns, Exxon is company A. Exxon owns company B. Exxon needs to buy some pipes, as an example, from company B. Exxon, considering they own company B, will jack up the price on company B. And then, because we have to pay back this, we now end up paying company B this higher price because it's coming out of our the revenues.
But Mr. Lowe, that sort of jiggery pokery in the US, it is unacceptable. It is unethical. There's a particular term that is used to describe that as being illegal. I don't know, but a lot of corruption happening in that place. Mr. Lowe's internet, he did indicate to us earlier. Agre, you're laughing. You understand, Mr. Chairman.
No, Mark,
ahead,
listen, I go to school in Trinidad, and I could tell you straight, one of the things that Dr. Rowley did when he came in is that they set up a committee where they brought people from different parts of the world to help track down these companies to see who was on what board, who whose family was on what board, so that you have a network of intelligence on, okay, these are the known associates of this person. These are the known companies that do work with this company. If in Guinea, if in Ghana, if in Middle East, wherever, Mexico, they have had this issue, you can pick up the foreign minister, Mr. Todd could call the guy in Mexico. What are some of the challenges you have? How has transfer pricing affected you? He can call Ghana. You can call him Middle East. There was just in Dubai the other day, a whole set of them. You can call persons to get insight of how things went down. Tell me what worked for you there. What were some of your challenges? How you were able to overcome it from first oil to now. So that you can now come back to Guyanese, sensible, right-thinking Guyanese, and say to them, hey, we spoke with X, Y, and Z. We realized, based on speaking with the energy people in Trinidad and Ghana and Mexico, we are taking this policy decision because we want more for you as a country. And I think Guyanese are looking for that from any government that takes power. And that is the kind of thing Sharma drives straight to the heart of the matter earlier. It will restore confidence in our institutions because one, they'll be trained, and two, they'll have good enough references across the world with enough intelligence and data especially. And I really want to drive home the point on data, because the reason why Elson could have made that point is because he was exposed to databases that are publicly available. Some of you have to pay, where you can know what is the real price for some pipe. You understand? You could Google and just search online and find and see what's the price for some pipe in one country versus the other, and see if the price we are paying here is the right price.
It's comparable. Compatible. Now, let me say this to you, Mr. Gray. I agree with you again 100%. Mr. Sharma Solomon there, you're smiling, you're talking, we're talking economics, we're looking at how the PPP, the installed PPP regime is bleeding the country. It's just a massive corruption, a nest of corrupt individuals. We know that there were some books that were printed, law books that were printed. When you checked out, it was just a storefront out somewhere on Liberty Avenue. So the PPP has a history of these sort of massive corruption. We see contracts being awarded to individuals who probably don't even know how to, I will speak as though I'm from somewhere on the West Coast, Berbice, Ola Ama, right? They're building all sorts of things, massive corruption under the PPP, and the people are being shortchanged. Meanwhile, our external debts keep going up and up and up and up, and ExxonMobil and foreign companies are taking advantage of Guyana. Over to you, Mr. Sharma Solomon.
Mark, typical of what is a classic case of a country running deep into corruption. I want to congratulate Risedale Ford on the case that he recently won against the Attorney General to ensure that our budgeted agencies are made autonomous. So when you have agencies, like I mentioned earlier, in the EPA not being allowed to work, we saw Dr. Vincent Adams being sent home. Prominent Guyanese, very well versed in the environmental matters. Those agencies, if allowed to work, and I spoke earlier about the structure that the government, if enacting the laws that were put forward by the last administration, will find more structures to go through. So it is important for this government for us to weaken those structures, to overlook those agencies, and to move. Let's put the GRA in place, for example. You cannot get a certain amount of work in terms of contracts if you don't get through certain compliance by the GRA to show that you've handled such funds before. You got bond that you will take to ensure that you are qualified. Any such contract comes with condition. It comes with compliance conditions at the GRA and even at the NIS that you would have employed so many people before to take on these sorts of works. Now, those agencies are overlooked. Those agencies are underfunded. Those agencies are being disregarded. So you can see certain national and natural protection of mangroves being cut down, and GRA says nothing. You can see a brand new bridge being built, hotel being built, and no environmental assessment impact being done. So if you are to go through those structures, if you were to take the legislation enacted, then we will now have to account for how we do things. Now, Guyana is borrowing big time. And many of these countries that we are borrowing from, of course, conditions, their firms, their companies will have to come in. But again, what sort of oversight are these countries providing with the loans that our country, that Guyana is borrowing? And you'll find very little. So you're right, Mark, that what we're seeing is a runaway train to corruption, because we would not see, it is difficult for anyone who would have not held a contract for more than $2 to get a $5 contract. That is the bottom line. Much less never having a $100 contract, because you would have failed even at the pre-qualification stage of the submission of your bid upfront. So even the procurement commission, the tender board, those are not being allowed to work, and deliberately so, because it allowed for these things to happen. Are these things being implemented? Then the right scrutiny and the right amount of eyes would have been over them, so that we don't end up where we are right now.
Well said, Mr. Sharma Solomon. Well said. Here is where again the people missed the coalition, because that's exactly what they were doing for the most part. And while they were not perfect, they were on the right track. It is sad that the country is just a massive corruption. The PPP is not concerned about these constitutional agencies and so forth. We see exactly what they're attempting to do with the Police Service Commission and so forth and so on. Let's welcome back Mr. Lowe. But before we get back to Mr. Lowe, we're glad to see you back, Mr. Lowe. There's something that I want to ask Mr. Sharma Solomon as the former chairman of Region Number 4. I've noticed Agray is laughing. Maybe Agray already preempted this next move.
I think I should correct you there, Mark, because the people of Region 10 are listening quite attentively. They do listen to your show. You said 4 just now.
I have said 4.
Well played, Sharma. Well played.
I must apologize, because I'm thinking our operator Lemon just put this at the side of me again, the splitting of Region 4. Thank you so much, the former chairman of Region Number 10. How do you feel when you see, and especially that you're hearing, that the current chairman, I think he still is the chairman, I haven't heard from him in a long time, but the current chairman has said that he has not been notified about this or whatever. But here it is, suddenly we're hearing that the government or the regime, the installed regime, has signed $346 million contract to a company that basically is a newbie, never heard of before. What is your take on that, sir?
Mark, so the concept to see development, as I said, we're having growth in Guyana. Money is being made. We hope that it is funded in the right way. Those loans come in the right way, the access to our resources. So it's good to see development. I know that structure was proposed a couple of years ago. So kudos to the coalition for ensuring that the people of Amelia's Ward and Bamia have access to another primary school. To see that contract, however, not involve the local stakeholders, such as the Regional Democratic Council, is indeed a sad moment of oversight. It's a sad moment for accountability. But beyond the chairman who represents the institution itself of the RDC, when the paid executive officer is going to even be referred to as the chairman of the region in certain circles, because it was to ensure that you give representation or recognition to the involvement of the RDC. So we read the news. That was there. The REO was called the regional chairman, and I think deliberately so, to demonstrate a level of involvement by that institution. But I made the point earlier, Mark, that the compliance agencies are not working. And had they had the opportunity to function, GRA would have upfront at the pre-qualification stage, even the procurement and tendering process, would have ensured that they give their opinion which would have been legal, which would have been professional, and which it carries points. You cannot get past the tendering process as somebody who knows even at the local level as a regional chairman. Because these bid documents are not open things that you write a letter. They're points that you have to score to qualify. And if you have not held such contracts before, if you don't have certain resources, equipment, and even the means by which you can manage that or demonstrate it before, then you wouldn't even get past the bid as far as to even get to the fact you have to seek the other means to qualify. So it is a disservice first to the authority and leadership in the region. It is a disrespect to the region for them not having their say and input in terms of how this project is going to be conducted and who are the contractors. And more so, it's a disservice and very disheartening to Guyanese that when you can see this sort of bypassing of the agencies and the signing of contracts, especially to such an amount, then I think it's a troubling sign right across Guyana that we can turn up tomorrow and anybody can get a contract.
All right, well said. Let's get back because our other guest, Mr. Elson Lowe, is having some serious problems with his internet. I know earlier I spoke about austerity. There's a debate going on in the economic world, austerity versus stimulus. And I asked Mr. Lowe to break that down for us because you know that debate you probably would have been reading up in terms of Blanchard, who was the former IMF, is actually part of that big debate. Mr. Lowe, before you touch on that in breaking down austerity and stimulus to our people, briefly that is, what is your take on the awarding of contracts to people who basically in any developed countries would not have been qualified? What is your take on that? All right, I've noticed everybody. Go ahead, Elson, you're back with us. You know, Elson Lowe, I know his internet is kind of like operating like how the Congress is coming up shortly. Sometimes you hear from them, sometimes you don't hear from some of the candidates and so forth. Mr. Elson Lowe, let's get back to him and see if we get him right now. His internet is very, very slow. I wonder how the candidates are doing. But before we get back to Mr. Lowe, I want to ask Mr. Sharma Solomon briefly to tell us a little bit about how he feels now that Vanessa Kissoon has been reinstated. It's not been official. We haven't seen any official statement from the party as yet. But according to a usually reliable source, that Ms. Vanessa Kissoon is back with the party as an official member. And you are also back with the party as an official member. What is your take on this latest development as it pertains to Vanessa Kissoon? Your microphone, sir.
Yes, Mark. The fact that, and I hear you saying back. Officially, yes, if that is the case.
Well, that's what I meant, officially back.
However, I'd make the point, because I am in that same context that you painted. We have never left. We have never gone anywhere. All right? I'm making that point to say this.
Sure.
That with or without positions, we have, even in or out of season, we've always served, and we've served well. We've served continuously for 3 elections. We've played our significant roles. And I think it was most unfair for what occurred in the case of Ms. Kissoon. And I think it was a grave injustice that it took so long for it to be corrected, based on the reports that you have gotten. Here it is, what in essence occurred is not just an injustice to an individual, but for those people who found favor in the style and politics that both Ms. Kissoon and I practice. Persons hadn't an opportunity for 2 elections to ensure that they had the sort of not preaching, but teaching of just what this PPP government has to offer, and how we can withstand and sustain ourselves so that we can appreciate to fight and fight harder so that we don't end up where we are today. That is the injustice. To add to what you ask, however, about this, which is purported in the media, we need to, in certain circles, and to be made official. I believe it's also a good opportunity now for the party, based on the upcoming Congress, to start to position itself as one where not only it's prepared to ensure there is inclusivity, but to ensure that every given member, every person willing, as I said, never left, those who continue to serve are given the opportunity to serve. And I believe this is where the sort of change for this battle of Congress will prepare us better for the war nationally that we face against the People's Progressive Party. So I am encouraged, I supported. I know the last time we were on your show, I told you, persons are making a thing that this carries so much energy that it's burdensome. It wasn't. It was a simple decision. Move a motion, second it, and it's carried. So that could have been done a long time ago, quite some time ago. The fact that it's being done now is good, but it's unfortunate that as we lead up to Congress, we see these sort of injustices being corrected, which should have been done a long time ago. But I'm happy for Ms. Kissoon. I am encouraged that I have gotten my membership resolved. I look forward, as we have always done, to give our commitment to ensuring the party is placed back where it belongs, and to ensure that the nation and the Guyanese people can have the sort of people that will represent their interests vigorously.
Well said, Sharma Solomon there for us, former chairman of Region 10. Region 10. Let me say that again, Region 10. Mr. Solomon, I agree with you also that this should not have been the case. They should not wait until the run-up to the Congress. But let me say kudos to the thousands of people who have brought this here to the forefront and were willing, and they were advocating on behalf of yourself and Vanessa Kissoon. But maybe in the past, we have not seen so much advocacy, so much persons, advocating for this particular cause as we have seen now. So kudos to all those people who have been advocating on your behalf and Vanessa Kissoon's as well. Let us go, because we're looking at the time and we don't want to lose Mr. Elson Lowe again. Elson Lowe again. So in closing, Mr. Lowe, from an economic standpoint, we know that the picture is not that good, even though there's a projection of the economy growing by 40% sometime next year or the year after. What will be your closing remarks, sir?
Mark, I have to say that the moment that I brought up the transfer pricing and the way that a certain company might be ripping off the country, we don't know, my internet got very slow, which I found to be quite entertaining.
Very slow.
But the point being, and I'll make a couple clean points here. The first is, I think that from the perspective of international oil companies, when you're dealing with a small country that is not auditing you, that gives you a lot of latitude to do whatever it is that you feel like doing. So maybe they weren't, maybe they were. The point is, we have not ensured that we criticize and we scrutinize and we audit. And so as a result, it is possible that we, just got ripped off. So we'll have to see. That's the first. And the second, just to touch back on what we're talking about regarding the contract that was awarded. That's a hefty contract. We'll see whether they're able to complete their works, or whether there's going to be a need for the contract to be expanded to address remediation works, because that's kind of how corruption scandals will work. These things are always built into the price. And now, just to close off regarding the broader economic situation, as we've been discussing for some time, what is important, and this touches a bit on the austerity versus the stimulus arguments, is that we respond to the national crisis, the natural disaster that COVID is, effectively. And we've only seen very limited response by the PPP. You got one round of cash grants. You've not seen any substantial response to that. And as a result, people are really suffering. The economy, is not performing, the non-oil economy, as it really would have been. And even further, we're seeing a real spike in inflation, which is making everything expensive and making it difficult to live in Guyana just as an ordinary citizen. And so, as a result of a poor response to the pandemic, what we're seeing right now is a substantial fall in people's standard of living. If times are hard, and people are complaining bitterly about how hard times are, and unless we improve our policy making, they'll get worse. Because one of the things that we observe, that we researched, and that we're observing now and will observe in the oil and gas economy, is that the cost of housing will be incredibly high. The cost of rent will be incredibly high because people in that sector of the economy can afford to pay these high rents. So that's going to put pressure on ordinary Guyanese. So when I talk about standards of living declining, about things getting worse rather than better, a simple example is, are you paying more rent while at the same time your salary is not higher? That is an example of your standard of living declining. So these are the challenges that we must face. I advise the coalition regarding preparing for these types of challenges, and the policies, so long as I remain in this position, the policies that you'll see coming forward out of the coalition will address these types of challenges and address the real risks that the country faces from things like corruption and epic mismanagement. But that's the case. Let's see what reforms will be done to ensure that the next round of spending by Exxon is audited. And I'll leave you with this. If that one is not audited, or there's delays as to its auditing, I think that will tell you all that you need to know about what is going on.
Well, I'm not gonna hold my breath. The next round will not be audited. It'll probably be another couple $2 billion again, and the people have to push their hands. Hardworking people out in places like Victoria, places like Monreplo, places like Manchester Village, Alness Village, Linden, out there, Wisma, Mackenzie, Ituni, Kokwani, Bartica. Speaking of Bartica, you spoke of earlier when you were just about to talk. A particular company, your internet just went slow. It went completely slow, then it died. Maybe it's just coincidence. But for 20-something years, going on 30 years, that company has been in Guyana. And I'll tell you what, it's a shame and disgrace that they're now saying that the people in Bartica, they're addressing people who have been without their landline phones for years. I don't know, shame and a disgrace. Let's go to a Gray, the man that's from Golden Grove, or is it Anne's Grove? All the Grove, Anne's Grove, Golden Grove. I don't know. Your closing remarks, and from a young man, because you're a young man, you attend the University of the West Indies, I believe. Correct me.
University of Trinidad and Tobago.
University of Trinidad and Tobago. Right. Good. So, Mr. Agray, from a young man's standpoint, what is your take on the political realm of things?
Before you ask me that question, Mark, I am deeply involved in telecommunications for a long time. And one of the things that I vehemently was looking forward for was the liberalization of our country in terms of telecommunications. But not just that. Liberalization is one part. Quickly. The second part is opening tax incentives. So small and medium-sized telecommunications companies can invest and get a license and open up our country so we get more fiber. That's the real issue. So that's two. Three, the other part, apart from taxation, they're good ways of managing your telecommunications sector, good models globally. So that we could go to Europe, they have good models in the Caribbean, Latin America. An internet exchange point where all 3 or 4 major telecommunication players in the country interconnect a different point. An easy solution, internet connection point in Berbice, where family from Mark. One in Georgetown. One where Mr. Sharm is in Linden. so that in case of an issue on any one of these companies, they can reroute traffic via the other one and cancel out in terms of pricing. Those are three clear, pointed things that we can do as a small country. One, to lower the cost of bringing internet to all of us, and two, increasing investment in the country. But go ahead with your question, Mark.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Mr. Agre there finally give me that position. I noticed I got a note here from Lemon to bypass you and allow Sharma Solomon now with his closing remark, but we'll ignore Lemon. But let me just say then that the liberalization of the telecommunications started under the coalition. Again, kudos to the coalition. A lot of people thought that it should have been done as swiftly as possible, maybe so, but it had to be done properly, right? And I guess that's exactly what the coalition they were doing as it pertains to the liberalization of telecommunications and so forth. So when the PPP regime were installed, they rushed through that bill without looking at it in a careful manner. But that was a bill that was prepared. Everything was prepared by the coalition government.
The agency was staff.
Everything. And you know that, Agri.
No?
So let's go with your closing remarks in terms of the politics of the day and encouraging younger people like Sharma Solomon and Lou, and maybe to some extent some of our viewers as well, right? What are young people looking for in politics, sir?
So, Mark, when you told me about coming here today, I had my personal views, but I thought as an engineer, you must never think that your way of delivering on a political solution is the only and the best way. You must always seek third and fourth opinions, because we are human beings and we make mistakes. So if you speak to a young man who lives in Kitty or All Boys Town, and you ask him what he wants, most of these young men, while they're smoking and drinking, I want to see if I could get work for oil and gas company. And I can give you a prime example. There's a guy who lived close to me, a couple of houses down. And I remember seeing one of the oil companies had that opening for interns. Interns, the requirements are much lower than, let's say, a field engineer. So anybody, let's say a CXC, you go GTI, you UG or whatever, you'll try to apply and get in. I said, bro, apply and get into this. There's a HSC thing. He's really into health and safety. You see this as something, he's not very scholastic, but he says this is something that he can achieve. And he filled out the form and go, and he encouraged another young man to also do the same thing. I'm saying that to say that education is one. The young people who are seeing development going on across the government. They're seeing the new X-Trails whisking by, the new Prados running by, and they realize that there's money being made. So, and they want to know how do they get into the industry. So education is one. Two, one of the things that I really would like to see a lot more, as Sharma was talking earlier about the village movement, is education at a village level, where you have good tradesmen, good workmen, good plumbers, taking one and two other young men in the village and bringing them on board so that you could transfer skills. So apart from education, one thing that it depends on which class you come from, how your family socialize, you will want money to invest to have a startup. So young people are looking now for, anytime you see there's a grant, anytime you see there's an opportunity for some funding, you'll see it being shared a lot in circles where you have young people. And thirdly, so second is money. And the third part is business. I've seen that there are quite a lot of young persons who are interested in entrepreneurship, and I've been one of them. I see that as a developing economy, new businesses will form, there will be new markets being created. As you well know, if you look at any numbers, if the GDP raised in the last 5 to 6 years, it simply means that the level of disposable income in the country has increased. So now you see people interested in wines. You 10, 20 years ago, did only a certain amount of people in this country would be interested in drinking wine. Only a certain amount of people will be interested in going and dine at executive restaurants, in hotels and that kind of thing. It's very small. Because there's an increase from the oil and gas workers who now have more money and the spin-offs, and they're paying higher. Now people have a little bit more disposable income. So these middle to upper class things are now popular. So entrepreneurship, so the three things in summary: money, so cash in hand, education, and the opportunity to start businesses so that they can work their way out of poverty into prosperity.
All right, well said. A great march there for you guys. Elton Lowe and all these young people. Let's give Mr. Sharma Solomon, former chairman of Region 10, former chairman of Region number 10. How, part of your brief closing remarks, sir, how uncomfortable it is, or people ought to be, not just in Region 4, but in the country, for what the PPP is attempting to do with Region 4, cut it in half. Your closing remarks include that.
So just on the closing, well, let me take that first. Gerrymandering is an unfair practice. This is classic gerrymandering to the case where you must hold the PPP accountable for this unfair sort of maneuvering. And there is the justification for this is as unethical as it doesn't even make sense for the reasons for doing this. And we are a population that we have a small number of people. The Guyanese in the diaspora lives in society that represents much more people than we do. So to say that the amount of people in Georgetown is hard for the structures we have in place to manage, then fix the structures, they'll work. Georgetown should not be, in fact, Region 4 should not be divided in that sense of how we are we see the PPP doing it. Let me add this to just that point of gerrymandering. The coalition built the structures of towns so that we can have capital towns in every region. What the PPP should have done is to consider some of those very basic structures than to entirely shifting the boundary, which, as I said, is a classic case of gerrymandering. For this, people of Region 4 should be very concerned because the implication go beyond the election results. It carries with it, even as it relates to development and developmental programs coming to your community. So we must not take lightly what the PPP is doing at the level of its political maneuvering to ensure that you have a split in Region 4 in terms of the geographical boundary. But what it means for communities such as those on the East Coast and those on the East Bank, that you will find yourselves at a slower pace of development. We see it already than we see Georgetown, if that is what the PPP's intentions are with regards to your development. So for people who think that this is a laid-back approach and it will be done anyhow, we must understand it carries implication beyond the political maneuvering. But in closing, Mark, let me just say that the country finds itself with a government at the moment that is bent on single-handedly managing the affairs of the nation. And we see where that continues to take us in every regard, including the COVID crisis. Guyanese are dying in numbers. The matter of COVID in general is being mishandled. The issue of flooding, there is an admittance that billions were spent unaccounted. The Minister of Agriculture is saying that needs to be accounted for. So there is no sharpness of where the PPP is lacking with reference to its accountability. And as we see these sort of divisive and divisive move in this gerrymandering approach towards the constituency of Region 4 and the region itself, I think that in itself is another single-handed destruction of what the PPP represents.
All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Mr. Lowe, great job tonight. Mr. Marsh, good job as well. Mr. Sharma Solomon, same to you. Glad that you are officially, and I use the word officially because you said you guys never left. I understand that, but officially, you are back in the party. Officially. Mr. Solomon and our guests, other guests, Lowe and Marsh, they are correct in terms of the gerrymandering to suit whatever it is that the PPP wants to do, which is to control Region 4. Sharma made a good point that the part that they may control in Region 4, if they're allowed to get away with this, they are going to ensure that that is developed and underdeveloped other areas in Region 4. So here is now what the people have to do in Region 4. The largest PNC block is in Region 4, over 200 and something thousand, close to 300,000 people. And every elections, the majority of those people vote for the PNC. I'm wondering whether those individuals are going to sit down and allow this to happen by these weeny-peeny little men in the PPP. I don't know. I hope it doesn't happen. Again, thanks to our guests, Lowe, Marsh, and Solomon, and to all of our listeners, every single one of you. I noticed some good points made by a lot of you. Gary Greenwich, good evening. But in particular, there's a point made by John Talbot. I don't have time to read everything now, but John is talking about lots of technical skills in the diaspora as well. Guyanese in the diaspora. Guyanese, in fact, talented Guyanese. But these people are being neglected by this installed regime. Speaking of the installed regime, I have lots of more things that I want to talk about, but our operator Lemon is saying that we've got to go. Gentlemen, thank you all so much. And to our listeners across Guyana and across the world, thank you. We will be back tomorrow again with more of Straight Up. We will have as our guest, hopefully we'll have one of the candidates for the upcoming Congress for the PNCR. And I can tell you guys that that candidate is not Joe Harmon, who will be my guest tomorrow evening. God bless you all, and God bless our beautiful country, Guyana. So long. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a good night. Yeah.
All right.
Body on your body.